FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
So from the very beginning, when the initial idea of the World Bank and IMF was presented at Bretton Woods, there were counter ideas. And the counter ideas were to strengthen this other institution that was being built, the United Nations, and to use the United Nations and its unique structure, one country, one vote, as the place to take on issues like development of war-torn economies from World War II. That was initially going to be the task of the World Bank. The World Bank, however, the task of rebuilding the war-torn economies, however, was something that the United States wanted to hold on to itself and to control itself, and so it did with the Marshall Plan. Again, initially, the International Monetary Fund was going to simply be an institution that was going to look out for economies that were in trouble so that we would never have another Great Depression and just feed those countries with capital. But at the heart of all of this, at the heart of this structure of the initial World Bank and IMF, was a belief that the United States, the U.S. economy, and U.S. corporations were going to be the driving force for all economic development following World War II. And that really, truly, what was good for GM was going to be good for the world. And that the World Bank would instead be used to give countries the money that they needed to build the infrastructure to facilitate the presence of U.S. corporations. And the IMF would be used to give them capital so that they could purchase U.S. goods and set up the regimes for U.S. corporations. And that international development was going to be based on this model. So at the same time as this idea is being pushed, we have increasingly and ever strenuously an alternative model being pursued at the United Nations. Now, the difference between the World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations. World Bank and IMF controlled by the United States, literally. Whichever country puts in the most money to those institutions has the largest say. Disproportionate weighted vote. United States controls the IMF and the World Bank. United Nations, one country, one vote. Very, very different format. Developing countries that were increasingly breaking off the chains of colonialism, moving into independence, said a part of this independence needed to be economic. And the United Nations needed to be the place for that. And we would push institutions like the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Center for Trade and Development, United Nations institutions that would be focused on economic equality, trade equality, full employment, all of these radical ideas that were emerging from the global South. The United States got very nervous, particularly in the 60s, but even more so in the 70s, when an alternative institution emerged that was really powerful, and it was called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, which was creating a model in which developing countries would not only be independent, they would be independent and hold on to their resources, and some pretty powerful resources, like oil. And the United States and the European Union were very concerned that other countries were going to follow this model with other resources, like labor, like agriculture, like trees, all sorts of resources that everyone else had but we didn't have. And the United States pushed increasing energy, money, political force into the World Bank and the IMF and went that direction instead of the United Nations direction. Through the course of the 70s and beginning in the 80s, and this story is all told in the book, developing countries became more and more indebted to the IMF and the World Bank. And that indebtedness opened up an opportunity to not just lock them into this initial framework of the IMF and the World Bank, but to require even more strenuous conditions, the structural adjustment programs, and to lock them in even further to a U.S. agenda. As that process heated up, the resistance also heated up. And for every country that was forced to succumb to a structural adjustment program, you see a resistance, powerful resistance movements, people demonstrating in the street, people sacrificing their lives in resistance. And one of the initial calls was for debt cancellation, an early unifying call. That call began to be heard in the United States. It began to be heard in the United States because, of course, it was our institutions that were imposing these structures on developing countries. And a united movement started to be born. That united movement really began to crystallize as the United States had to succumb to the same policies of the developing countries. So when U.S. corporations were looking around the world and they're saying, gosh, we're getting really cool things in the Philippines and really cool things in Bolivia, why aren't we getting the same access and rights in the United States and in the European Union and in Canada? So they came up with the North American Free Trade Agreement. They came up with the World Trade Organization. They came up with institutions that would apply the same policies here. And as soon as people in the United States started feeling the same impacts themselves, they began to look in greater solidarity with people throughout the world who have been struggling with the same programs. And you begin to see global unity in this struggle. And the place where this global unity hits its pinnacle and receives the most attention is in the 1999 protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle. Developing country delegates stood up inside the negotiations. People from all around the world and the North protested outside of the negotiations so the developing country delegates could point outside and say, you don't even have the support of your own people. We don't have to follow you this time. They had millions of people protesting in their own streets, and a global movement was revealed that has continued to this day and has had tremendous success, such that over the course of the years, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have been dramatically sidelined as institutions. And nothing could have sidelined the World Bank more than Paul Wolfowitz being named to the head of the World Bank. That wasn't the intention of the Bush administration, but it was the result. Because a hated country put a hated man in charge of a hated institution and added to the demise almost of this institution. Now, the IMF and the World Bank countries are increasingly refusing to pay back their loans, refusing to take new loans. Other countries are refusing to put money in to the institutions, and they are being sidelined, and they are succumbing to this global pressure of movements.